Sit down, Jeff. Welcome back. I'm Michael Hayward. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Stephen Meyer. Meyer. I've known Stephen for what, 10 years? Yeah. Meyer. I just call you Stephen.
Right.
Who's going to give our second public lecture? That's the one. Second public lecture, of which I don't have the title, but it's multimodal.
Yeah.
And Empson, and it's all going to be fantastic.
I'll give you the title.
Anyway, Stephen Meyer works at the University of Washington in St. Louis in the English Literature Department. So maybe you can explain to me why you work in your universities in St. Louis and Keith's is at Little Rock. Prepositions. Those damn prepositions. Anyway, Stephen has written extensively on a variety of topics, but most notably, I would say, Stein and Whitehead, including a special issue which you contributed to, organised, of configurations on Whitehead. First monograph, Irresistible Dictation, which was your big Stein splash. Currently working two major projects, one on robust empiricism, which is returning to William James, another of your abiding interests, and also the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Science as well. So very busy. So looking forward to it, but most of all, probably most important, he's a good guy.
He's a good guy too. Okay. So first off, therefore, I will title is Guide Signs. Whitehead on multimodal perception, Empson on types of ambiguity. And I should say there is a handout, if you don't have it, of a couple of poems. It looks like this, like any handout, from a distance. Okay. All right. Very good. So I'm going to try to liven things up. They've been alive, but it's difficult by the end of the day to stay alive. So that's what I think I take as my primary responsibility. First, thanks to Roland for this gift, not of me lecturing, but of providing a setting and space once more in which it becomes possible to re-enter Whitehead's thought, this time through the avenue of his meditations on symbolism. Thanks as well to Jeff and Joe for variously enabling Roland and us to realize his vision. As you'll have seen, or at least the other speakers will have seen, I've generously interpreted the conference instructions. You won't find any quotations from symbolism among the 22 pages of quotations I distributed. Instead, I figured that as other speakers will have mined this work, if not exhaustively, then thoroughly, it might prove useful to juxtapose the 1927 volume with the more fully developed remarks in Process and Reality. Not only does Process and Reality represent the acme, as it were, of Whitehead's consideration of symbolism, aside from the important discussion several years later in Adventures of Ideas of non-sensuous perception, quote, the vast background and foreground of non-sensuous perception with which sense perception is fused and without which it cannot be. But it also places his enormously important account of perception squarely within the framework of the philosophy of organism, as the earlier, more preliminary lectures had not. And of course, I have assembled a talk that consists, or that I did in what I distributed. This is no longer the case. Which may have been an ideal that consists entirely of others' words, which may have been an ideal of Benjamin's, but is probably something that as a live presentation, where you don't have the opportunity to go back over these words and make them your own, would be fairly hard going for the audience. The ideal Helen Wendler proposes in one of the quotations of reading the whole poem through before beginning to talk about it may be appropriate for some poems and in some circumstances, but not always, and less so when it is a matter of prose not of poems. Even if, as you'll have noticed, I have included some poetry. That was actually supposed to be a whole sentence, a complete sentence instead. I started it off forgetting that. So it was fast, short sentence, so I couldn't correct midstream. At key points, namely at the beginning of each of the several sections of quotations, I cite poetry of J. Wright's, and then again in the final section, a poem by William Empson. Here I'm actually tweaking Wendler a bit, since Wright's poetry is actually a single poem, which I have divided syntactically into its four elements: a question, followed by a question, followed by a statement, followed by a statement. I've deliberately chosen not to provide the whole poem complete, that's her phrase, in that version of the talk, the preliminary version. I do so despite appearances on the handout, which you can take a look at, with the poem side up, which includes the same poem on the left-hand side, coupled with a second on the right. It might appear you now have the whole poem complete. But as you'll see, the beginning of the second poem expressly plays with the end of the first, or to put it differently, the first foreshadows the second, coupling the word and notion coupled, implicitly challenging the autonomy of the single poem, as does the place of these poems just past the halfway point in the longer series. Now you can turn the page to see the longer series. Of 33 poems, these are the titles, which are also the first lines, that comprise book 2 of a double book, the Guide Signs, which is what you see the full contents of this double two-book book, which itself comprises the final 2 books of a 10-book sequence published between 1971 and 2007. I've also provided, as you see, a table of contents for this last volume for your enjoyment. The titles / first lines are quite delightful just on their own. I should say a few words about Wright as well as about Empson, who is my primary subject today, before I continue. J. Wright was born, I'm going to make the assumption nobody here is familiar with Wright's work. Any exceptions to that?
That's correct.
Okay, very good. Or not so very good, but that's what I would expect. See, I could foretell. J. Wright was born, but you'll see why it's actually a slightly surprising fact, even if it is a true one. J. Wright was born in 1935 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, far off Empson's orbit, or Whitehead's for that matter, though Empson, as I'll explain in a moment, had no small orbit. 1935, so 5 years after the epochal critical study 7 Types of Ambiguity, Empson's first book, was published. Aside from 3 years in the US Army in Germany in the mid-1950s and a year in Scotland in the 1970s, Wright has inhabited the Western Hemisphere, including several years in Mexico, and the last 30 plus spent in New Hampshire and Vermont. Wright went to Berkeley in the late 1950s, then proceeded first to the Union Theological Seminary, then on to Rutgers, where he studied comparative literature. He never finished a dissertation on Dante, and has since enjoyed a precarious existence on the edge of the academy. Wright reads Whitehead and scholars of Whitehead, but he is probably closer to the work of Suzanne Langer, which is why I cited the brief quotations from her 1941 bestseller, A New Key to Philosophy, dedicated, of course, to Whitehead, who directed her dissertation at Harvard, as well as much larger chunks of the text surrounding these brief passages, Langer's book. These are the brief quotations are actually from Wright, an earlier book of Wright's, where he cites this material. So I'll just myself cite the 2 passages now for those of you who didn't get all this material, and for those of you who got all the material but don't know you got it or didn't read it or whatnot, to give you a sense of how Whitehead's distinctive understanding of symbolism, in fact, and this may surprise you, was available to a wide audience. Certainly wider than one might have expected, for more than 500,000 copies of Langer's book have been sold. Okay, it's the best-selling American work of philosophy ever. And so the passages that Wright cites are the following two. First off, and each of them is in fact what he calls in this particular volume, it's called Elaine's book. Elaine is his sister-in-law. And there are a bunch of these prose passages, citations scattered through the work, which he calls confrontations. And the first, this is the 10th confrontation, and the 11th are both these citations from Leiner's work. The 10th thing runs very short. And the triumph of empiricism is jeopardized by the surprising truth that our sense data are primarily symbols. Close quote. The second, then, quotation from, I think, the same page or page following in Leiner's book. Quote, first ellipses, then, the edifice of human knowledge stands before us not as a vast collection of sense reports, but as a structure of facts that are symbols, italicized, and laws that are their meanings, italicized, close quote. So those are, I just wanted to give those to you as a sample, and you've got to realize 500,000 people plus have read those. So there's hope. Okay. Although himself no best-selling author, indeed, largely unread and rarely reviewed or written about, Wright is a major contemporary American poet, an early MacArthur Fellow, and in 2005 was awarded the Bollingen Prize, the most prestigious poetry prize in the US, given for a body of work. He was and remains the only African American to have received the award. And it's easy enough to convey a sense of his cultural invisibility. That year, the New York Times happened not to report on the award, as it usually does. This is 2005. As for Empson, Seven Types is generally acknowledged as having inaugurated, or perhaps more exactly set the standard for so-called close reading practices in the Anglo-American Academy. It is based on a senior thesis Empson wrote as an undergraduate at Cambridge under the supervision of I.A. Richards, who more than anyone else is responsible with works like The Meaning of Meaning with C.K. Ogden in 1923, Principles of Literary Criticism in 1924, and Practical Criticism in 1927, for institutionalizing modern-day literary criticism in the British and American University. But Pache Wendler, here I'm referring to, again, one of the quotations I handed out, Richards wasn't, before Empson hit his desk, an especially exciting reader of poems. He was really interesting on poetry, but poems less so. Empson transformed Richards as a reader. No doubt this was a rather strange experience. Some of us may have this experience, some not, for the student to have such an influence on a teacher. And you get a sense of the strangeness from the opening of an essay Richards wrote for a 1974 Festschrift for his former student half a century on, okay? Richards was fairly young, and as I say, Empson was 20 years old. Quote, long ago, Richards reported, quote, when a bound copy of Seven Types first reached me, in Peking it was, I used to press it on likely readers with this recommendation. It will make you feel you are having a lovely go of influenza. High fever fireworks, you know? Close quote. A lovely go of influenza. Not everyone's idea of a good time. Richards then observes, it's a beautiful bit of ambivalence, okay? And of course it has embedded in it this issue of who's influencing whom. Richards then observes how he actually kept coming down with the flu while writing the testimonial. Okay, so he's not gotten over it yet. 50 years later. They were very close, but very competitive. Elsewhere, Richards recalled the origin of his students' work. Quote, at about his third visit in tutorial, he brought up the games of interpretation which Laura Riding and Robert Graves had been playing in the 1927 volume, A Survey of Modernist Poetry, with the unpunctuated form of Shakespeare's sonnet, The Expense of Spirit in a Waste of Shame. Taking the sonnet as a conjurer takes his hat, he produced an endless swarm of lively rabbits from it, and ended by, "You could do that with any poetry, couldn't you?" This was a godsend to a director of studies, so I said, "You'd better go off and do it, hadn't you?" Close quote. Shortly after the influenza analogy, Richards, a passionate mountain climber, offered a more measured estimate of Empson's accomplishments. Quote, and again, how many of you are familiar with 7 Types of Ambiguity? So just one of us, 2 of us. It's an amazing book, okay? And it transformed English studies. And it's not what you think close reading is like. So this is Richards, quote, "Empson's minute examinations," even here the ambivalence ever so minutely shows itself, quote, "raised the standards of ambition and achievement in a difficult and very hazardous art. This sort of thing often happens in sports and the sciences. Great examples might be, in sport, the entire transformation of the possible that has occurred since the 30s with the developments of aids in rock and ice climbing. And in science, the consequences, shall we say, of the transistor. But in the arts of reading, arts tedious and devious as they must be, such sudden revelations of new powers are perhaps even more surprising. Yet, he adds begrudgingly, Empson seems to have done it." Close quote. The year before 7 Types was published, Empson, now a graduate student at Cambridge, this is why I'm here tonight, speaking to you to enliven things. He was expelled from the university and even exiled from the town of Cambridge on account of a sexual peccadillo. He had had a woman over for the night in his rooms, and condoms were secured as evidence. On account of this outrageous behavior, whether on his part or the university's, he was in fact regularly compared with Shelley in the press when this was going down, and in letters people were writing back and forth, who had similarly been expelled only from Oxford a little over a century earlier. As a result of this, Empson led a highly peripatetic life of teaching for the next 20 years. First in Japan, then in the mid-30s, following Richards in Peking. By the way, I was wondering, Hyedong, are you? Okay, I wonder, are you familiar with Richards' 1932 volume, Mencius on the Mind? I've not read it. It's apparently one of his best books. It's subtitled Experiments on Multiple Definitions, the work on the complications between translation and interpretation in various forms. Anyway, I'm going to be sprinkling this talk with occasional call-outs, just because, again, that's what I'm here for. So he spent the mid-30s following Richards in Peking. He was on the China desk of the BBC during the Second World War, then returned to China for some more years. Finally, in the early 1950s, he secured a position at Sheffield and proceeded to wage war on the Christianization of English studies in the UK that had occurred in his absence. He tried to undo it. His most important works, aside from 7 Types, are the 1935 Some Versions of Pastoral, the astonishing Structure of Complex Words of 1951, and the 1961 Milton's God, a study precisely of sympathy for the devil, which Beatrice referred to in Milton's Paradise Lost, the text that both Blake and Shelley were in fact responding to. It's an amazing book. And one more thing. Before Empson switched over to English, courtesy of the Director of Studies to be, Richards, I gave you a quote of Christopher Isherwood describing the mesmerizing effect of Richards on Cambridge undergraduates in the mid-20s. He had been an extremely promising student of mathematics at Cambridge, Mecca still then of British mathematical investigation. I mention this to segue to the focus of the present talk, the coincidence indicated by the title of the first set of quotations I distributed, 1927 to 1930, of Empson beginning to investigate in 1927 what he would call ambiguities, the same year, and at Cambridge, that Whitehead delivered his lectures on symbolism at the University of Virginia. Over the next 3 years, Empson continued to refine his argument, even as Whitehead refined his, ensuing in the 1929 publication of Process and Reality and the Function of Reason. Now, I'm not making a particular claim for influence between Richards and Empson, yes, but not between Whitehead and Empson, or at least not yet. I could rest there and affirm with Bergson, when he was accused of having cribbed from William James, that despite having read very early an essay or two of James's, this had no effect on the development of his thought. Moreover, as Bergson observed to James, the common tendencies of their thought were so much more compelling precisely because they seemed to have arrived at them independently. I don't entirely believe Bergson's protests, and also don't believe that one only comes down with influenza from exposure to close associates. This is why I've included in the packet a quotation from Richards, where he asserts, despite the strong behaviorist tendencies his work, and you can again see this in the Isherwood quote, his work exhibited in the 1920s and beyond, that his quote, this is Richards, and one of the interests of this is that he's actually, it's an interview, but he's being interviewed by a former student of his who's now, who studied with him at Cambridge in England, was now a colleague of his at Harvard, named Ruben Brouwer, who is a very important figure in the development of literary criticism in the late 50s and early 60s. And so if he's talking about this to Brouwer in this context, and you see very sort of directly and precisely, there's no reason to think that he wasn't talking about similar things with Empson, but I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to say that. So this is Richards. He's saying that his, quote, psychology came out of G.F. Stout, one of the big James Ward article, out of the big James Ward article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was a huge deal, this particular article in the 1880s in England, and William James's 2 volumes, The Principles of Psychology. Those were the really formative things. Those and Sherrington's integrative action of the nervous system to put the physiology in it. In this, he was only bringing James's own neurology up to date. Though Empson had read James's 1907 volume Pragmatism in the 1930s, explicitly associating James with Richards, there's no evidence that he also read James's psychology. Nevertheless, he was a better reader of the psychology than Richards was, whether or not he actually read the work. And that is enough for me to couple, using that term, Empson and Whitehead, not just Empson and James. Incidentally, Steve, as Keith knows much better than I do, there's plenty of evidence, including a marked up copy of the Principles, I think in the Leuven Husserl collection, of Husserl's great interest in Jamesian psychology, which perhaps suffices to account for the similarities you noted between Husserl and Whitehead. They both are similar because of the interest in James, possibly. That said, I need to explain why the somewhat forced, as it may appear, linkage of Whitehead and Empson isn't just a historical curiosity or something which should only be of interest to scholars of literature. In the final quotes from Process and Reality in the packet, Whitehead suggests, this is from Process and Reality, I just said that. Whitehead suggests that one might generalize the notion of symbolism from the most typical case of symbolic reference to causal efficacy by means of perception and mode of immediacy to any number of alternate couplings. For instance, synesthetic, that is between 2 varieties of sense perception, so long, as he notes, as the 2 species in question, right, of symbols and of meanings, are correlated by some ground of relatedness. Now, what I want to suggest is that the range of ambiguities with which Empson was concerned and which he investigated in his early work may serve as a template for investigation of Whiteheadian symbolism that isn't limited to the basic causal efficacy presentational immediacy combo. In fact, I'm sure it can serve in this capacity. It just makes things more complicated. I'm sorry. As Whitehead proposed, quote, language is the example of symbolism which most naturally presents itself for consideration of the uses of symbolism. Of course, whether it remains the example that most naturally suggests itself in our image-saturated world is surely debatable. Yet, to the extent that Whitehead is right about language, then the sentence which follows, the sentence I just cited, suggests why turning to poetry and to Empson might prove so valuable. For the sake of simplicity, I'm talking about the sake of complexity, okay? But for the sake of simplicity, he says, Whitehead writes, only spoken language will be considered here. Close quote. Now, images in spoken language, the simpler modes of symbolism, in their pervasiveness, surely are appropriate for the purposes of Whitehead's argument. But further development of the argument, okay, which he did not do for the most part. He left it, like so many other things, to other people to do, and people completely fell flat on this one. But further developments of the argument have to attend to the more complex forms that symbolism takes in the varieties of human experience that in so many respects, as Michael tells me he will remark on tomorrow, so you better be there, are both more and less than human. Here, poetry provides a necessary instance, not just because its contents have often been characterized in similar terms, but because of the sort of experience recorded in my quotation of Mark Strand, another important US poet who died this past weekend. Quote, "I'm not absolutely sure what it is that I'm saying," Strand proposed in an interview. Quote, "I'm just willing to let it be." He continues, "It's this beyondness, that depth that you reach in a poem, that keeps you returning to it." Close quote. The interest, right, is how common this sentiment is among readers as well as writers of poetry. Nothing special about it at all. Beyondness refers to Strand's sense of the poem as being beyond him, whether he is writing it, or reading what he has written. And that's a big part of its appeal, the sense that the poem is, as he says, smarter than I am. Close quote. Here's another quote. "The symbols," you may recognize it, "the symbols are specific enough, but it is often extremely difficult to analyze what lies beyond them." This sentence from Symbolism, which Sherry cited earlier, alludes to the same sense of beyondness. And the same beyondness is also tied to what James called feelings of tendency or direction, and to what Whitehead calls perception in the mode of efficacy. Now here's a new quote. "How did you get where you ended up?" That's a question we all ask ourselves and each other every day. Right? Why is anybody here, etc. And then longer historical questions about oneself. How did you get where you ended up? This is the sort of question that, according to Strand, engages the writer as well as the reader of poetry. Richard says, in another quote that I give you, that this is, quote, the poet's own secret. But I'm pretty confident that it was in the passages I've cited from his 1926 volume Science and Poetry, which conclude with this assertion, and which begin with the assertion that, quote, "most words are ambiguous as regards their plain sense," close quote, that the seeds of Empson's investigation of the varieties of ambiguity can be found, with Empson refusing to be satisfied with a formulation whereby the answer to the mystery, an unknown, is merely another mystery, or unknown, the poet's secret. Not very satisfying, especially for a mathematician. To construct an answer, Empson had to push Richards a lot further than Richards was himself prepared at the time to go. This is why I've also given you a series of quotations regarding the term interinanimation, which Richards coined earlier in the decade on the ground of Donne's use of a similar verbal form. Where Helen Vendler offers a schematic, in another of the quotes, and as I would put it, rigid and rigidifying variant on the meaning of this term, its attraction for Richards was precisely that he could keep on shifting the meaning as he used it, depending on context and inspiration. Empson's use of ambiguity is similarly imaginative, one might even say symbolic, and variable rather than fixed. He's also having a lot of fun because if there's one thing mathematicians do not like, it's ambiguity. So as a former, recently lapsed mathematician, he is tweaking his thumb at himself and others. It's similarly imaginative, one might even say symbolic and variable rather than fixed. Quote, I propose to use the word in an extended sense. He wrote, if you want to know what I'm thinking about in terms of robust empiricisms, that's the kind of thing, using a word in an extended sense. And he wrote at the outset of 7 types, quote, and shall think relevant to my subject any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language, close quote. Adding a footnote in the 1947 second edition explaining the change he has made here to his original formulation, quote, the new phrase is not meant to be decisive, right? Any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language, but to avoid confusing the reader. It's pretty clear. Pretty clear. And you guys would have to sit around for a minute or two before you said, oh yeah, I got it. And then you wanted to look at a few examples and you said, oh yeah, I really do get it. Okay, so I understand it. But it's pretty clear talking about ambiguity, right? Easy to be unclear. The new phrase, he says, is not meant to be decisive, but to avoid confusing the reader. Naturally, the question of what would be the best definition of ambiguity, whether the example in hand should be called ambiguous, crops up all through the book. Close quote. As Richards was well aware, the interest of ambiguity in Empson's hands actually lay not in the room therein provided for alternative reactions to the same piece of language, but in Empson's analysis of the various sorts of interinanimation of and between the 2 or more alternative reactions that different phrases exhibit, possibly even the same phrases in different poems. Symbolism in a nutshell. Richards makes perfectly clear that we are dealing with Whiteheadian symbolism when we are dealing with Empsonian verbal analysis, which is what Empson called it. Although he is not discussing 7 types when he does this, but the later structure of complex words, where Empson analyzes what he terms the equations such words exhibit rather than their ambiguities. You'll notice he returns to the mathematical figuration, the symbol from math. The 2 works overlap a good deal in subject matter, although Empson insists that they need to be sharply distinguished insofar as the earlier work deals with what might be termed nonce equations. This means that the interinanimation in the word or phrase in question occurs just in that poem, on that one occasion, or the more Whiteheadian, in the one occasion. Whereas Empson was concerned in the structure of complex words to elucidate more enduring patterns of interinanimation that particular words exhibit. I forget who you tomorrow was talking about, somebody named Raymond Williams, and when you were talking about that, Williams in the material you're partly talking about is in fact responding to Empson, who is very important for Williams. In any case, so the more enduring patterns of interinanimation, in other words, not just in a particular poem that the poet happens to come to in the writing of that poem, but the terms which in fact have these very complex structures of meaning and exhibit them over broad periods of time. Whether it's the 1920s in England, whether it's the 18th century in the US, whatever, but and not limited to one person. Okay, so it's a different kind of, the different object of analysis, but very similar techniques. Words such as the English, quote unquote, you have never heard this word before, definitely not in this room, dog. Okay, brilliant essay on dog, brilliant essay on honest. A whole sequence of essays on the term, which is especially relevant in the context of what he's writing about, sense. What we're talking about, sense. As in good sense, common sense, but also sense, as in sensations and meaning and so on and so forth. Richards, in his Festschrift essay, is more than happy to second Empson's proposal. This will actually startle you with the ambitiousness of it, and the carefully worked out scheme for how it might be effected, of including, quote, the interactions of the senses of a word, close quote, in subsequent editions of the Oxford English Dictionary, rather than simply listing the senses alone together in their solitariness. Okay, he figured out a way to do this that wouldn't add much to the length, but he was ignored. Okay, of course, Empson's proposal fell on deaf ears, hardly prepared, perhaps, to appreciate, quote, the sound and feel of the words, close quote, of poems. That's Richards, let alone Empson's analysis of just, quote, how it is done, which the poet can't quite say, even though, as Richards observes, and he might as well have been speaking of Mark Strand, he knows how to do it. All right, that's the first part of my talk. The second, there are only two, will consist of 5 minutes left. Oh my God. Okay, so I will just give you a little bit here, and then there'll be another issue that comes. I know, see, at least I've got your attention, so this moved quickly. The second consists of a series of annotations and comments regarding the congeries of passages that I distributed to the other speakers. So first of all, I want to say this because it's a fairly provocative statement on my part, following a fairly provocative statement on Whitehead's part. One, in the study of ideas, it is necessary to remember that insistence on hard-headed clarity, he says this kind of thing all over the place, but this is a particularly delightful version of it. The insistence on hard-headed clarity issues from sentimental feeling, as it were a mist cloaking the perplexities of fact. Insistence on clarity at all costs is based on sheer superstition as to the mode in which human intelligence functions. Our reasonings grasp at straws for premises and float on gossamers for deductions. Close quote. Adventures of Ideas. This is why you can't talk about Whitehead without talking about poetry. It's why it is so hard for trained philosophers, who of all people should be prepared to read Whitehead, to do so. Because the philosophy of organism is a philosophy of poetry. It's not that it's just about poetry or poems, but from God on down, it's a universe of poetry. Now, of course, quite as many philosophers have taken an interest in the poet and the poetry as have exiled him or her from the discipline. But that strikes me as different from what Whitehead was up to. For he wasn't just talking about reading poems, mining them for philosophical wisdom. He did not distinguish between the universe and a poem. And you can't if you really appreciate his arguments against the bifurcation of nature. Okay, that's the strong statement. Okay. Now, I'm going to then give you one item here. I'm not going to read through the extended analysis that I've got here of J. Wright. This is the first syntactical element in the poem that I'm using here as a kind of a rich, not mined example. Would the wood now reveal a principled seating, latent properties made actual after the fact of that first possession? Would the wood? This is not an Empsonian ambiguity. Instead of two meanings in one word, it is two words and two or more meanings in a homophone. But hidden in both wood and wood is word. And with that turn to the words as words, you begin to see how they begin to function as symbols in Wright's poem, combining the non-sensuous perception of wood the wood with the sense perception of the words. Okay, stuff about what Empson's doing, a lot of stuff about it, called perception. And this is something coming out of that. Number 4. The interpretation through enunciation of Richard's as reader aloud, those are phrases of Helen Wendler's, of the whole poem complete, lodged itself in our ears. That's Wendler. Lodging itself in our ears is one way of putting it, a sort of taste in the head, which is what 3 pages here talking about, is another. Obviously, the latter isn't self-limited to the enunciation of words. We mostly talk about poems as if they're mostly about they're mostly to be read aloud. There's of course a tremendous amount going on that is barely reached orally. Now, then, okay, I'll actually stop at this one, and then I'll offer you something else. This is the next question, second element in Wright's poem, and I'll just say a few things about it. What speech is imposed by the signatum? First mother, a knife, point, confusion of tail and head, culled in the emblem namaruku, in that pure and static state before the first authoritative act. Didn't quite read that right, so question at the end didn't really come out as a question. Here's a quote, against those who assign meaning, signatum, not to the sign, but to the thing itself, the simplest and truest argument would be that nobody has ever smelled or tasted the meaning of cheese, quotes, or apple, quotes. There is no signatum without signum, continuing my quote. The meaning of the word cheese cannot be inferred from a non-linguistic acquaintance with cheddar or with camembert without the assistance of the verbal code, close quote. This is from Roman Jakobson's classic 1959 essay on linguistic aspects of translation. Most academic literary scholars will have read this, or at least know about it. Most other people will not. No doubt Wright's signatum echoes Jakobson's. I'm not going to go near the question of how to describe the relation between the two uses in terms of Whiteheadian symbolic reference, that is Jakobson's use of the term and Wright's use of the term in the poem, other than to point out that Wright should not be supposed to be taking over Jakobson's term simply passively. Okay, he's doing something with it. That's what makes it symbolic. This is an example of poetic discourse, after all. As for how Jakobson's understanding of signatum, unrelated to the actual taste of cheese or apple, is related to Empson's ambiguity, a sort of taste in the head, I'll leave that for another day as well. Namaruku. Na, or first mother, plus muru, or knife, plus ku, pointed tail, or head. Or as Wright has it in these lines, a first mother, knife, a point, confusion of tail and head, culled in the emblem, namaruku. This is a Bambana term, or Bambara. What interests Wright especially about it is that this sort of term may have its origins with the Bambana people in Mali, but it can turn up also in Dogon ritual practices. So there's a lot of overlap, and obviously he has a very broad interest generally in overlap, and he's given you everything you needed. You just would never know it. It's like Ezra Pound. He gives you all the stuff in his Chinese calligraphy, and then but you don't know it until you actually look it up and discover this. And Namaraka in the next poem is a similar term. I won't, and he does a similar thing there. So I'm going to actually stop with that. Well, okay, this is what I'll end on. I was going to actually give you an extended reading of Empson's, but I'm going to have to leave that to you to enjoy, though I can point you towards one. But here, I just want to give you 3 passages to think about together. They're respectively from James, from Richards, and from Whitehead. And they, if I've been able to do the 3 pages that I went over, Whitehead Empson has an extraordinarily interesting description of atmosphere in a poem, which is conveyed. For him, it's the whole poem that is conveyed in the atmosphere and is experienced, as he puts it, like a sensation which is not attached to any sense. And as he also puts it, it is the equivalent of a taste in the head. Right? And so these are 3 what I take to be less figurative descriptions of the same phenomenon. So here's James, short, quote, "Experience from the very first presents us with concreted objects vaguely continuous with the rest of the world, which envelops them in space and time, and potentially divisible into inward elements and parts." Yeah, that's James. The next here is that in his Principles of Literary Criticism from 1925, Richards coined a term which looks like it ought to be pronounced synesthesia, but it doesn't look like synesthesia. It's spelled C-O-E-N-E-S. And so it's in fact pronounced synesthesia as opposed to synesthesia. And it has a different root structure. He uses it to refer to the extraordinarily, this is a quote, "numerous and varied effects in the body of almost all stimuli of whatever nature." Then he refers to the whole mass, they all fuse with the whole mass of internal sensations to form the synesthesia, the whole bodily consciousness, tinging it, altering its general character in some one or perhaps 1,000 different ways. Okay, now this is a fairly, as I say, fairly reductive version of the same set of phenomena, the same set of concerns. The final one is then from Whitehead, where the passage about influence, we're talking about causal efficacy, then he gets to, "This is our general sense of existence as one item among others in the efficacious actual world." Right? I'll close on that note. Happy to take questions if there's any time.
Dr. Rowland. There's part of me which thinks that was so lovely in a performance that we could just relax. But I don't want to take away from you any engagement with your audience. But, I mean, I having cut myself. There's one thing.
You have a question.
It's one thought.
Okay, that one thought.
As you were talking and we talk about symbolism, I suddenly realised in one of your autobiographical sketches that Whitehead talks about, when he obviously talks about himself in an autobiographical sketch, very late on, he said, "My first love and enduring love was symbolic logic."
Mm-hmm.
And he's very careful with his language, and the fact that he decides to talk about symbolism, and yet it's symbolic logic which was dear to his heart. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And Whitehead was fighting the rigidification of symbolic logic at Harvard the whole time he was there. Langer, who has a complex relation with Whitehead, she can't abide his generalization of feeling, but she also does all kinds of wonderful work in the context of thinking with him. She was aware and appreciated his differences with many of the Young Turks. Of course, the most famous one to emerge at that point was Quine, whose dissertation Whitehead directed, and who Whitehead considered brilliant and hoped that Quine would come around as he matured into youth. But that never happened, not in the 90 plus years that he graced our land. But so Whitehead actually, there's some stuff Whitehead has read. It's very clear his notion of symbolic logic is entirely in sync with his understanding of symbolism. It's one of the forms that symbolism takes, and that his account of symbolism had to be adequate to symbolic logic, and symbolic logic had to conform to the account of symbolism that he gives, as it does not in most hands.
Thank you. I was provoked is perhaps too strong a word, but triggered maybe when you talked about philosophy of organism requires poetry, or is the universe of poetry. And it made me think of a couple things. First is the passage from the Symbolism book that we've been looking at, where he talks about how normally language is the symbol that refers to trees, But for the poet,
Right.
it's the trees that are the symbol, and the words are the referent of the trees. And it also made me think that in the beginning of Process and Reality, Whitehead sees himself as in some ways reversing sort of the Western philosophical tradition of emphasis upon facts and turning it towards process. And you'd mentioned how poetry has to be read aloud, and you have to read through the poem first before you then begin to analyze it. And I guess I'm more just sharing my reaction to your thoughts than asking a question. But is that sort of what you had in mind when you're thinking that philosophy of organism requires poetry? That's some of those implications of Whitehead's project.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The one thing that, again, what I would insist on, but most people would not, is that the great, and I'm somebody who has spent more than my fair share of time listening to poets read, some of them wonderfully, some of them terribly. But as a specialist in 20th century poetry in a department with a very good creative writing program, poets are coming through all the time. And I'm kind of sick of it. But, I mean, it's been a long time I've been doing that. But I have to say the point is that for most people, the fastest way to get into a poem is either to read it aloud or to hear somebody else read it aloud. Now, that's not true about all poems, because there are lots of poems where that only will take you to the front door, and you still have to open the door. And so the interest for me in making this argument, partly with Empson, is because what he's doing with attending to the, to use Richard's term, the interanimations among meanings. We're not talking about international. Richards is interested mostly in interanimations among words. But Empson is about the interanimation among meanings. And what you get there is what you can call, people have used this phrase in different contexts, right, vibrating words. But that's a vibration which is comparable to the way my words right now are functioning in a vibratory fashion, which aided by all kinds of gestures, hand and vocal and eye contact and whatever, right? But it's in fact not limited to the sonic register. And again, Empson in his analysis pays relatively little attention to sound effects. And he sure as hell does not need to pay any more attention than he does. So that's the only thing I would say that is not about poetry being read aloud, but it's the capacity for words to take on this which makes them more complex. I mean, the experience is more complex than ordinary conversation, which is complex enough, and the ordinary lecture, which is complex enough, but this is even more complex. But it has to be included in the kind of phenomena that Whitehead is concerned to elucidate with his account of symbolism. And then it sort of explodes through. I mean, because again, Whitehead, calls God the poet of the world. Okay, this is hardly, as everybody knows here, a loose, use of language. And I'm just trying to demonstrate that we can go much further with it in this respect than one might have anticipated. Is there time for one more question? I think there was a hand. Great. Yeah?
Okay.
It's your hand.
Yeah, I just want to make sure there are no others surrounding him.
Yeah.
So what you just said was actually similar to what I just wanted you to say a little bit more about. You said something about the poem is smarter than the person reading it. And I was wondering how that might relate to the idea that God is the poet of the world. If we were the ones to read the poem.
Sure.
Or relate ourselves to God in a way. I'm just seeing it in a symbolism.
Yeah, and one of there are two ways that I think begin to get at an answer there. First of all, the quote wasn't exactly smarter than the person reading it. It was smarter than the person writing it.
Or writing it.
No, but I mean, because it might be a little more offensive if one thought, well, you think you're smarter than I am, and you immediately attribute it to the poet as being smarter than the reader and playing tricks. But the poet is in the same circumstance as the reader, and not just when the poem is finished. And what that has to do, presumably, is comparable to Whitehead's understanding of God, right? Which is God has nothing to do with persons. This is an interpretation of Whitehead, but God is in touch with actual occasions, thinks about, feels for actual occasions, has no interest whatsoever in societies of occasions. This is an interpretation, but it's one that I actually abide by. And so what the poet, and again, it makes life relatively hard as a person, especially if you're a believer, okay? But this is one of the radical features of Whitehead's account of God. And it's what made him into somebody who wouldn't acknowledge a particular religious faith. And so anyways, the point is that this experience, of course, right, the poem is smarter than the person. It's the poem in the actual occasion where the experience is happening, rather than within the society. So all kinds of claims for his understanding of how life lurks, and the interstices, all that stuff is absolutely part of this account of poetry. That's why I'm saying you can't have his universe without a reasonably adequate account of poetry. And we have had some very fine accounts, but this is actually looking at how perhaps the best reader of poetry in the 20th century in English language communities does it.
Sorry, last follow-up. This sort of turns poetry into a kind of dark. I mean, this is like the sort of the poetic capacities of God, and life lurks in the interstices and so forth, right? That has absolutely really no interest in persons. Right?
Well, again, I wouldn't say it has no interest in persons.
Well, I mean,
yeah, I know. I'm just trying to, because many people think it has top down.
But no. But this is like kind of a dark theology.
Well, here's. Let me then give you one. I'll give you an answer by something that I didn't get to here, but in Empson's types of ambiguity, the final type, the ultimate type, as it were, he goes from sort of it's a spectrum from, and this is terminology that he doesn't use, but I use coming off of Whitehead, from contrast, basic contrasts, to contradictions, full contradictions. That's the spectrum of the relations between the meanings that you're dealing with. So various forms of how that is involved, and so here is maybe his last poem. He was a very good poet. He was what I would call a major minor poet. He's a poet who survives, but he's not a poet like Eliot, okay, or Stevens or whomever. This is a poem. So it's a late poem called "Let It Go." Okay, we've already been talking about "Let It Be" and such. So that it is this deep blankness. Is the real thing strange? The more things happen to you, the more you can't tell or remember even what they were. That's the first stanza. Okay, the second stanza is 3 lines rhyming with the 3 lines in the first stanza. The contradictions cover such a range. The talk would talk and go so far aslant. You don't want Madhouse and the whole thing there. Okay, and his understanding of the 7 types of ambiguity there is actually, it's about mental conflict, which he thinks was quite germane in the 20th century among poets. So yes, there is this is not fluff that we're dealing with here. Somebody said something, but I don't.
Just, it's not all puppies and unicorns.
Not all puppies and unicorns, no. And not even just not just people sitting on chairs.
But it doesn't exclude puppies and unicorns, right?
What?
It doesn't exclude puppies and unicorns.
It certainly does not exclude puppies and unicorns. Absolutely. There's a tremendous comic, poetic, and even sentimental poetic tradition, which is just as valuable as the torturous side of things. Anyway, thank you, everybody.